The mountains of Sinaloa are quiet at dusk. The sun sinks behind the jagged hills, spilling gold and crimson light over the valleys where secrets sleep beneath the soil. The air is still, heavy with the scent of dust and orange blossoms, and somewhere far below, a convoy moves along the dirt road, headlights glimmering like tiny stars. This is where our story begins, in a land where power grows like a shadow, and every name carries both fear and reverence. Among these names, one stands apart, Iván Archivaldo Guzmán Salazar, known to the world as El Chapito, the prince who inherited the throne of one of the most powerful criminal empires on earth. He was born into a dynasty that ruled not through crowns or flags, but through silence, loyalty, and control. His father, Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán, was already a legend when Iván came into the world, a man whispered about across borders, hunted by governments, and worshipped by those who saw him as untouchable. Iván's life began under the same watchful eyes that followed his father, in a house surrounded by guards, secrets, and an unspoken truth. One day, the empire might be his to carry. The people of Sinaloa call it destiny, but for a child born into such a name, destiny feels more like a chain. Iván's childhood was shaped not by fairy tales, but by codes and rules. He learned early that trust could kill, that silence could save, and that every luxury had a price. His father's visits were fleeting, his words measured, his presence more myth than man. When El Chapo appeared, it was as though time itself paused. The boy watched the men around him straighten their backs, the air grow heavier, and the shadows in the room seemed to bend toward the figure who ruled them all. There is something haunting about being born into power you did not earn. The world already expects you to command it, to live up to a legend you did not create. As Iván grew, he felt the pull of that expectation, the invisible weight of a name that brought both respect and terror. The stories of his father's exploits were bedtime tales, but they were not told to entertain, they were lessons. Each one carried a warning: loyalty above all, strength without hesitation, and never let fear show. The nights in Sinaloa are long and quiet. The sound of insects hums beneath the stars, and the wind carries with it the faint echoes of gunfire from distant valleys. In these moments, young Iván would stand by the window, watching the horizon. He knew his father was out there, somewhere between myth and man, fighting battles that few would ever understand. To the world, El Chapo was a criminal mastermind. To Iván, he was a father who lived in shadows. As he grew older, the world around him began to change. The Sinaloa Cartel was no longer a secret, it was a global power, a ghostly network that reached across oceans. News channels spoke his father's name with a strange fascination, half fear, half admiration. Iván's life became an echo of that fascination. Wherever he went, he was not seen as a boy, but as an extension of something larger, something dangerous. Every glance carried questions, every friendship came with risk. Yet within the chaos, there was calm. The ranches of Sinaloa, with their quiet courtyards and whispering palm trees, offered moments of stillness. Iván learned to find comfort in the rhythm of that silence, the way the crickets sang at night, the way the mountains watched over him like ancient sentinels. There was peace in that isolation, but it was a fragile kind of peace, built on secrecy and control. As he entered adolescence, the lines between right and wrong blurred. He understood that the empire that protected him also destroyed others. He saw the wealth, the power, the reverence, but also the fear, the loss, and the blood that made it possible. Still, the world outside his gates would never see the doubt behind his eyes. To them, Iván was born ready, the prince of the cartel, heir to the Sinaloa throne. But what they did not see was the quiet loneliness of that inheritance. A boy who could never choose his path, only walked the one that had already been carved by his father's footsteps. He learned to hide his emotions, to keep his thoughts guarded, to wear the calm expression of a man twice his age. The people who served his family called him El Chapito with a mix of affection and fear. To them, he was both a child and a symbol, a reminder that the dynasty would never die. As night falls over the mountains, the lights of Culiacan flicker in the distance. Somewhere in the city, men whisper his name in reverence, others in hatred. But up here, in the quiet of the hills, the world slows to a hush. The stars look down upon a boy standing at the edge of his inheritance, caught between childhood and empire, between myth and man. And as the wind moves softly through the trees, the narrator's voice fades into calm reflection. This is not just the story of a criminal dynasty. It is the story of a son born in the shadow of a king, destined to inherit a throne built from both loyalty and loss. The question lingers gently in the air, like a whisper carried on the wind: can a prince ever escape the crown he never asked to wear? The roots of power often grow in silence. Long before Iván Archivaldo Guzmán was born, before his father's name echoed across continents, there was only the Sierra Madre, vast, untamed, and ancient. The mountains of Sinaloa have always been more than geography, they are a living presence, a place where stories are whispered in the wind and where the line between survival and legend blurs. The land itself seems to hold memories, of farmers turned smugglers, of families who traded corn for poppy, and of men who carried ambition like a weapon. In those mountains, a boy named Joaquín Guzmán Lora grew up under the burning Mexican sun. He was poor, restless, and driven by a hunger that went beyond food. The small villages of Badiraguato were carved into the earth like secrets, unreachable and forgotten by the rest of the world. Roads were few, opportunities fewer. For most, the only choices were to leave, or to bend the land to your will. The opium fields offered one of the few ways to survive, and from those fields, a new kind of power began to take root. Joaquín, the man who would one day be called El Chapo, began as a farmhand. He sold oranges on dusty roads and watched the older men count money they made from poppy resin. It was not morality that shaped him, but necessity. The Sierra taught him a simple truth: to control the land, you must understand its hunger. By the time he reached his 20s, he had already learned the art of moving unseen, of trusting only those who shared his blood, and of building loyalty through generosity and fear. The foundation of the Sinaloa Empire began quietly, with a man who refused to be forgotten. When Iván was born in 1983, the world his father had built was already expanding beyond the mountains. El Chapo was no longer just a smuggler, he was becoming an architect of one of the most complex trafficking networks in history. The timing of Iván's birth placed him at a crossroads, the moment when Sinaloa's old-world isolation was giving way to a modern empire. Cocaine routes from Colombia were merging with the infrastructure of the Mexican cartels. Plains, tunnels, and secret airstrips connected jungles to cities, oceans to deserts. The trade was global, but its heart still beat in those remote valleys where the Guzmán name carried weight. Iván's early years were shaped by this duality, the rustic world of the mountains and the sleek machinery of an empire in motion. He was born into comfort, yet surrounded by men hardened by poverty and conflict. His father, often absent, was already a figure of folklore. To the people of Sinaloa, El Chapo was something between a saint and a ghost, a man who defied governments and shared his wealth with those who needed it. The locals spoke of him with pride, even as soldiers hunted his name. Children grew up repeating his stories. Like bedtime myths, he escaped through tunnels, they whispered. He tricked the army. He vanished into the hills. In that atmosphere, Iván's identity began to form. He was not merely the son of a powerful man, he was the heir to a bloodline born from the soil of Sinaloa itself. The older generation believed the mountains blessed certain families with resilience and cunning. To them, the Guzmáns were chosen, men of the Sierra who had turned dust into destiny. And so, from the moment Iván opened his eyes, the expectations of that destiny wrapped around him like a cloak. His family's origins were a paradox, poverty that birthed riches, hardship that gave rise to empire. El Chapo's father, Emilio Guzmán, had been a rancher who struggled to feed his family. The stories tell of young Joaquín selling fruit, sometimes stealing to survive. It was this relentless fight against scarcity that shaped the future of his bloodline. Iván inherited not only wealth but the spirit of a survivor, the instinct to build, protect, and command. Yet behind every triumph in the Sierra, there was a cost. The land demanded loyalty, and the trade demanded blood. The 1980s were turbulent years for Mexico. Corruption ran deep, alliances shifted constantly, and entire communities depended on the quiet prosperity that the drug trade brought. For many in Sinaloa, the cartels were not villains, they were providers, employers, and sometimes protectors. This moral grayness became the backdrop of Iván's upbringing. The boy would grow up in a world where legality and loyalty were opposites, where morality was measured not by law but by honor. At family gatherings, the adults spoke in code. Conversations were cautious, laughter edged with tension. There was an awareness that every phone call could be listened to, every visitor a risk. Yet beneath the anxiety, there was pride, the pride of being untouchable, of belonging to a lineage that the world feared but could not erase. As Iván grew, he came to understand that his father's empire was not just built on violence, but on something deeper, trust between families, decades of alliances, and an intricate web of unspoken rules. In the heart of Sinaloa, power is not shouted, it is whispered. Men speak softly, but their words carry weight. Deals are made with handshakes, betrayals punished in silence. This was the language Iván inherited before he even learned to speak. He watched how his uncles and his father's associates moved, slow, deliberate, calm. Their confidence came not from noise, but from the quiet assurance of men who controlled everything they could see. Sometimes, at night, the lights of passing helicopters would flicker across the hills. The sound would wake the household, but no one panicked, it was routine. The mountains had their own rhythm, danger by day, calm by night. Iván would lie awake, listening to the distant hum fade into the darkness. Those nights taught him that power was not always loud. Sometimes it was invisible, hidden, patient, and enduring. As the 1990s approached, the Guzmán name had already crossed oceans. Governments began to label El Chapo as one of the world's most wanted men. But in Sinaloa, he was still the same boy from the mountains who had made it impossible for poverty to return. For Iván, this contrast defined his heritage. His father was both criminal and hero, sinner and savior. That duality would shape every choice he would later make. The empire's strength was rooted in the land, and so was its weakness. Every generation that rose from the Sierra carried its ghosts. The same mountains that protected them could also trap them. The same loyalty that united them could turn into rivalry. Iván's story was already being written by the terrain that gave birth to his bloodline. When the sun sets over the Sierra Madre, the mountains cast long, solemn shadows that stretch across the valleys like reminders of the past. It is easy to believe that the land remembers every secret ever buried in its soil. In those shadows lie the beginnings of the Guzmán dynasty, the hunger of a father, the birth of a son, and the weight of an empire that would one day rest upon his shoulders. And as the evening wind sighs through the canyons, it carries with it the quiet prophecy of Sinaloa, that power, once rooted in blood, never truly dies. It simply waits for the next heir to claim it. Childhood is supposed to be a time of wonder, of scraped knees, games under the sun, and dreams that reach beyond the hills. But for Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, childhood was a performance in silence. His world was built behind guarded walls and shaded glass, where innocence had to learn how to listen before it could speak. The laughter of other children was replaced by the murmur of radios, the bark of commands from bodyguards, and the low growl of engines starting before dawn. For most, Sinaloa was home. For Iván, it was a kingdom, one he could see but not yet rule. He was born into a paradox, privilege born from peril, luxury wrapped around fear. His father's empire stretched across continents, yet Iván's own movements were limited to a few secure compounds. Every morning began with a ritual, a security sweep, a convoy, and a mother's quiet instruction to stay away from windows. He grew up surrounded by the scent of polished leather, cigarettes, and the faint sweetness of expensive cologne that lingered on the men who guarded him. Even the air seemed heavy with secrets. Griselda López Pérez, his mother, played the role of both protector and teacher. She had learned to live between danger and decorum, to raise her children with gentleness in a world built on violence. She insisted on education, on discipline, on dignity. Under her watch, Iván's days were filled with private tutors, English lessons, and long hours reading, though the outside world fascinated him far more than textbooks ever could. When the lessons ended, he would wander the ranch grounds, staring at the horizon as if trying to see the father who was always somewhere beyond it. El Chapo's visits were rare and unpredictable. He would appear suddenly, bringing gifts, toy cars, watches, crisp bills folded into envelopes, and a brief burst of joy that electrified the household. The guards would stand taller, the air would tighten with respect. Iván, even as a child, understood that these moments were special. His father's presence filled the space like thunder before a storm, powerful, magnetic, impossible to ignore. But it never lasted long. Sooner or later, the vehicles would start again, the engines echoing into the mountains, and El Chapo would vanish into his war with the world. Those absences carved something into Iván, a quiet emptiness, a question he could never quite name. Who was his father, really? A hero, a criminal, or both? He only knew that everyone else seemed to fear and love him in equal measure. Teachers lowered their voices when his surname was mentioned. Strangers offered respect too quickly, their eyes darting away after. For a child trying to understand himself, such attention was both flattering and suffocating. At home, the world was orderly, predictable, rehearsed. Guards rotated shifts every few hours. Meals were served on schedule. The radio murmured with coded news that Iván was not supposed to hear but always did. There was talk of shipments, alliances, betrayals, words that sounded strange coming from the lips of adults yet felt normal to him. He learned to interpret the tone of a conversation, to sense when something had gone wrong long before anyone admitted it. These were lessons no school could teach, yet they would define the man he would become. Despite the security and luxury, there was loneliness in his days. Other children could not come over to play. Every friendship had to be vetted, every outing pre-approved. Even at family gatherings, the atmosphere was cautious, laughter was measured, smiles brief. Yet within this cage, Iván developed a quiet curiosity. He listened to his uncles and his fathers. Men talk about loyalty, about the dangers of betrayal, about how respect had to be earned through action. These words sank deep into his young mind. The few times he escaped into ordinary life, he felt both exhilaration and unease. Trips to the city were like brief windows into another existence, crowded markets, music from open windows, children who could walk freely without a convoy behind them. Iván would watch them from the car, his hand pressed against the glass, wondering what it would feel like to belong to a world without guns. But that fantasy would fade quickly. The roads always led back to the ranch, back to the guards, back to the unspoken rule that safety was never guaranteed. At night, his mother would tell him stories, not of fairy tale princes or dragons, but of real people from the Sierra who had survived hardship and built legacies. Her voice was steady, soothing, and beneath the tales of struggle was a quiet message: strength was inherited, and so was danger. Iván would fall asleep to the hum of insects and the faint echo of distant gunfire, sounds that lulled him the way rain might soothe another child. As he grew older, he began to sense the hidden hierarchy around him. Every guard had a rank, every visitor a motive. The men who came to see his father spoke in riddles, their eyes sharp, their words coded. Sometimes, he would catch them glancing at him, assessing him, the heir, the son, the future. Even as a child, he understood that he was being watched not for who he was, but for what he represented. By his teenage years, he had grown into confidence that seemed older than his age. His speech was calm, deliberate, his gaze steady. He had inherited his father's poise, that quiet dominance that made others lower their voices. Yet inside, there remained a flicker of uncertainty. He admired his father's power but feared the violence that came with it. He envied his freedom but dreaded his enemies. It was a contradiction he carried like a secret flame, hidden beneath the surface of every smile. In the evenings, when the sun dipped below the mountains and the air turned cool, Iván would sit outside alone. The world beyond the fence was quiet, no sound but the wind through the grass. He would stare at the horizon, wondering where his father was, whether he was safe, whether he would ever come home for good. Somewhere deep down, he must have known that peace was not meant for people like them. He once asked his mother why their family could not live like others, why they always had to hide. She looked at him for a long time before answering softly, because your father built a world that others want to destroy. And now it's ours to protect. That answer stayed with him. It was not pride she spoke with, nor fear, it was acceptance. And in that acceptance, Iván found his first understanding of what it meant to be a Guzmán. He would carry that name like a shield, like armor he could never remove. It would define how others saw him, how the world treated him, and eventually, how he would rule. But for now, in those quiet years of guarded innocence, he was still only a boy, a prince behind walls, waiting to grow into a kingdom built on silence. The night closes softly around the ranch, and the stars scatter above him like watchful eyes. Somewhere out there, his father moves through the dark, hunted and unbroken. And here, under the same sky, the sun waits, unaware that the world is already whispering his name. There are stories that children inherit before they can even understand them, stories told not through words, but through silence, reputation, and the weight of a name. For Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, the story of his father was not just family history, it was prophecy. By the time he reached adolescence, the myth of Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán had grown larger than life, spreading through villages, cities, and borders like smoke. People whispered it with a mix of fear and awe, tales of escapes through tunnels, fortunes buried in mountains, and a man who could outwit entire armies. For the rest of the world, El Chapo was a ghost. For Iván, he was blood. The father's war had begun long before the son could join it. The 1980s and early 1990s were the years when El Chapo carved his empire into the Mexican landscape, not with crowns, but with cunning and violence. As Iván grew up behind guarded walls, his father moved through jungles, cities, and deserts, weaving alliances and betraying those who stood in his way. To understand Iván's path, one must first understand the lessons he inherited, lessons taught not in classrooms, but in shadows. The first and most sacred rule of El Chapo's world was loyalty. It was a loyalty that demanded more than trust, it demanded silence, sacrifice, and obedience. Iván watched this from a distance, but even from that distance, the lesson was clear. The people who served his father were more than employees, they were believers. They followed not because of money, but because of fear and respect. In Sinaloa, El Chapo's word was law, and disobedience was a death sentence. When Joaquín came home, his presence carried the tension of a man constantly hunted. He would arrive suddenly, one day the house silent, the next alive with movement as guards prepared for his entry. Iván would see his father step out of the vehicle, his expression unreadable, his body language both calm and dangerous. He never raised his voice, but every word he spoke carried the weight of command. To a young boy, that kind of power felt otherworldly. El Chapo was not a distant myth in those brief moments, he was a teacher. His lessons were simple, sometimes only a sentence long, but they stayed with Iván forever. Never let them see your fear. A man is only as strong as his word. You can't buy loyalty, you earn it with respect. They were words forged in blood, passed from father to son in quiet conversations that sounded more like prophecy than advice. At night, when the adults spoke in low tones over the hum of the generator, Iván would sit near the window and listen. He heard fragments of his father's war, the battles with rival cartels, the corruption of politicians, the shifting alliances with Colombian suppliers. There were mentions of betrayals, raids, and escapes. These stories were told not with pride, but with necessity. Power in that world was never permanent, it was borrowed, held as long as fear kept it intact. The father's war was not just against enemies, it was against time, against the state, against fate itself. El Chapo had built his empire on unpredictability. He trusted no one completely, not even those closest to him. That paranoia, that careful mistrust, became part of Iván's inheritance. The boy learned to read expressions, to measure the space between words. He began to understand that in his father's world, truth was a weapon, and silence was armor. As the 1990s unfolded, the Mexican government intensified its hunt for cartel leaders. Raids became routine, and news broadcasts carried the image of El Chapo more often than politicians. Iván watched those broadcasts with fascination. There was pride in seeing his father command such power, but also a quiet unease. The same man the world called untouchable was also the one who could vanish overnight. Every arrest, every gunfight, every betrayal echoed in the boy's dreams. Sometimes, his father would speak to him about strategy, not as to a child, but as to a student. He explained how routes were chosen, how shipments moved, how trust was balanced with fear. He would draw lines in the dirt, showing how territory worked, how alliances shifted like sand. For Iván, these were lessons in empire building disguised as bedtime stories. He didn't yet realize that each one was preparing him for a future he could neither refuse nor escape. When El Chapo disappeared for weeks or months, rumors filled the air like smoke. Some said he had fled to Guatemala, others claimed he was killed. But he always returned, alive, defiant, carrying the scent of danger with him. To Iván, that resilience became a symbol. His father could not be defeated, only delayed. Yet beneath the legend, the man was growing tired. Years of running had hardened him, and the circle around him grew smaller, tighter, more dangerous. Then came 1993, the year that would change everything. Iván was 10 years old when the news broke that his father had been captured in Guatemala. The arrest made headlines across the world, and the boy's carefully guarded world trembled for the first time. Soldiers surrounded the family compounds, phones went silent, and the adults stopped smiling. The empire did not fall, but it bent under the weight of uncertainty. For Iván, it was his first taste of loss, not the loss of a person, but of control. He remembered the silence most of all. The house that once echoed with movement was suddenly still. His mother's voice was softer, her eyes more distant. The men who guarded him were tense, their weapons always within reach. Every noise outside the gates made him flinch. In that stillness, Iván realized what power truly meant, not comfort, not wealth, but the ability to survive when everything else collapsed. Even behind bars, El Chapo's reach extended beyond the walls. Stories of his influence inside prison became part of cartel folklore. He ran operations from confinement, directed orders through visitors and coded messages. For Iván, this was another lesson, that real power does not end with capture. It adapts, it hides, it endures. The father's war was far from over, but for the son, it had just begun. The arrest became the turning point that transformed Iván's quiet admiration into determination. He understood now that his father's life was not a story of endless victory, it was a cycle of triumph and downfall, rise and exile. And one day, it would be his turn to face the same forces. When he looked at the photo of his father being led away in handcuffs, his expression calm, his chin lifted, something stirred within him, a mix of pride and defiance. The world saw a criminal captured, Iván saw a king who refused to kneel. That image would remain etched in his memory, shaping his understanding of strength for years to come. As the desert winds blew across Sinaloa, carrying the scent of dust and heat, Iván stood on the veranda of his home, staring at the horizon. The empire was still his inheritance, but now it felt fragile, vulnerable. He was beginning to understand that the Guzmán name was both shield and target. And somewhere in the silence between mountains and memory, he made a promise to himself, that he would learn his father's lessons well, that he would never show fear, and that one day, when his time came, he would not inherit the throne as a boy, but claim it as a man who understood what it truly cost. There are moments in every man's life when innocence quietly dissolves into awareness, not in a single violent instant, but slowly, like the tide receding from a shore. For Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, that transformation began in the shadows of Sinaloa, after his father's first imprisonment. The world around him had changed. The laughter in the courtyards faded, the guards stood tenser, and the whispers carried names and threats he could now understand. The boy who once watched his father's soldiers with wonder was beginning to see what they truly were, not protectors, but predators in finely pressed shirts. Without his father's presence, the household became both fortress and cage. The Guzmán name still commanded power, but it also drew danger. Rivals who had once bowed now saw opportunity. The cartel world had no patience for weakness, and Iván's family, isolated and under constant surveillance, had to prove they still mattered. For the first time, he began to sense the true nature of the inheritance waiting for him. It was not wealth or luxury, but a crown built on paranoia. He was still a teenager when he began to shadow the older men who handled the business. They spoke to him with a mix of respect and caution. They called him El Chapito, the little Chapo, and though it was meant as affection, the nickname carried pressure. It reminded everyone, especially him, that he wasn't just Iván, he was the son of a legend. Every decision, every mistake, would be measured against his father's shadow. In those years, the Sinaloa Cartel was shifting. With El Chapo imprisoned, leadership fractured. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the quiet strategist, kept things stable, but tension brewed. Rivals from Tijuana and Juarez were watching, waiting for the empire to weaken. Iván listened to these discussions late at night, when men gathered around maps and spoke in low voices about routes, shipments, and betrayals. It was his education, not from books, but from danger. His uncle, Aureliano Guzmán Lora, known as El Guano, played a guiding role during this time. A man of the old guard, he was cautious, pragmatic, and fiercely loyal to the family. Under his supervision, Iván learned the operational basics, how to manage people, how to move money, and, most importantly, how to keep secrets. But he also learned something more subtle, that survival in this world required emotional armor. The men who lasted longest were those who never allowed fear or affection to cloud their judgment. The nights in Sinaloa were long and heavy, filled with the buzz of cicadas and the distant growl of engines patrolling the hills. Iván often stood on balconies, watching the lights of Culiacán shimmer below. It was a beautiful city, full of life, laughter, and music, but he knew that beneath its rhythm flowed rivers of blood and money. Every nightclub, every car dealership, every politician's mansion, they were all threads in the same tapestry his father had woven. He could feel that invisible network pulsing through the city, like veins beneath skin. He began to train himself to think like his father. He studied the reports, the logistics, the way alliances formed and fractured. He listened more than he spoke. When people tried to test him, he learned to respond with silence, a weapon sharper than words. Those who underestimated him because of his youth often regretted it. Still, there were moments when the weight felt too much to bear. He would remember his father's visits, the rare times when the man behind the myth smiled, when the world seemed safe and simple. But now, safety was an illusion. He saw what power cost, the sleepless nights, the guarded meals, the constant uncertainty of who might betray you next. The glamour that outsiders imagined was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, in prison, El Chapo was already plotting his escape. Word of his plans spread like rumor, and for Iván, it became a secret source of strength. The idea that his father might return, that the king could break free from his chains, filled him with both hope and dread. What kind of man would his father be after years in confinement? What kind of son would he need Iván to become? During this period, Iván's mother, Griselda Lopez Perez, worked tirelessly to protect her children from the chaos. She managed the household with discipline and caution, keeping her sons away from unnecessary attention. But the Guzmán family could never truly disappear. Their name was too large, their enemies too eager. And so, Iván grew up in a paradox, shielded yet exposed, privileged yet hunted. By the late 1990s, he had begun to earn quiet respect within the organization. His calm demeanor contrasted with the impulsive brutality that defined many cartel heirs. He was observant, calculating, and patient, qualities that reminded the old man of El Mayo Zambada himself. But beneath that calmness was an ember of ambition. Iván wanted to prove that he could do more than inherit power, he wanted to wield it. Then, in 2001, the impossible happened. News spread across Mexico like wildfire. Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán had escaped from prison, smuggled out in a laundry cart. It was a story so audacious that it instantly became legend. For Iván, the moment was transformative. The myth had returned to life. His father, once thought caged forever, was now free again, a ghost risen from confinement. When El Chapo reunited with his family, Iván saw not just a father, but a survivor. The older man's face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes still burned with purpose. The empire would be rebuilt, stronger than before. This time, however, there was a difference. El Chapo no longer wanted his sons to watch from the sidelines. He wanted them to learn, to participate, to prepare for the future. That was when Iván's training truly began. His father spoke to him about alliances, about keeping enemies close, about understanding the value of loyalty not as emotion, but as currency. People are like doors, El Chapo told him once. You must know which ones to open, and which ones to lock forever. It was during these formative years that Iván began to glimpse his destiny. He understood now that the Guzmán name could not be escaped. It was carved into him, bone deep. The power, the fear, the respect, it all came with a cost he was only beginning to understand. But beneath that burden, there was also pride. He was his father's son, and though the world around him was built on shadows, he would learn to walk within them, unafraid. Each night, as the sun sank into the Sierra Madre, Iván would watch the horizon turn gold and blood red. Somewhere beyond those mountains, his father's men were moving, convoys in the dark, carrying shipments worth fortunes. And somewhere deep inside, the boy who had once listened to whispers was becoming something else entirely. He was no longer just the prince of a fallen empire. He was the heir to a throne that demanded strength, cunning, and silence. And in the silence of those long Sinaloan nights, the transformation began, the making of a man who would one day inherit both the glory and the curse of his father's world. The morning light over the Sierra Madre had a way of softening even the hardest landscapes, turning dust into gold and shadows into secrets. For Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, those mountains had always been both home and cage, the jagged edges of his inheritance. By the time his father had returned to power in the early 2000s, Iván was no longer the quiet observer. He had begun to step into the folds of the family business, not as a boy under protection, but as a young man being tested. The world around him was shifting fast. Globalization had changed everything. Drugs no longer traveled only through Mexico, they were part of a vast network stretching from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Chicago and New York. Airplanes, tunnels, and submarines replaced mules and convoys. The business had evolved into an empire of logistics, encryption, and diplomacy, and Iván, still in his early 20s, was expected to learn it all. His father's return to power had ignited both fear and opportunity. Within months of escaping prison, El Chapo had begun to rebuild alliances, reclaim routes, and crush opposition. His rise was ruthless, methodical, and unstoppable. Yet behind every decisive move was a new generation, his sons, watching, learning, preparing. Iván found himself caught between two worlds, the brutal traditions of his father's era and the digital, decentralized cartel economy emerging in his own. He began accompanying trusted lieutenants on business trips, first within Sinaloa, then across the border into Sonora and Durango. These weren't glamorous excursions. They were meetings held in dimly lit ranch houses, in half-abandoned motels, in dusty airstrips where cash and information changed hands like contraband. He observed how deals were struck, not with contracts, but with eye contact and silence. Trust, he realized, wasn't spoken, it was tested. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of expectation. Older men would study him quietly, gauging whether this young heir had his father's steel. They spoke to him with careful respect, sometimes with subtle skepticism. But Iván had inherited more than his father's name, he had inherited his patience, his way of listening before speaking. He didn't demand authority, he earned it through composure. In a world driven by violence, that calmness was more powerful than rage. El Chapo's leadership style was legendary, he led not by speeches, but by example. He was everywhere and nowhere, always moving, always adapting. Iván learned to mirror that. He began coordinating small operations under the watchful eyes of veterans, managing money routes and logistical details. It was a quiet initiation, the kind that didn't make headlines but shaped the foundation of a future leader. At home, his father continued to teach him through riddles and rules. Power, he said once, is not about control. It's about perception. You must make people believe you are inevitable. Iván carried that phrase like a mantra. It changed the way he looked at everything, from his wardrobe to his words. In the underworld, image was armor. A man who appeared unshakable could command loyalty even from those who secretly feared him. Yet beneath that growing confidence, Iván was still haunted by the instability of his world. He knew that every empire eventually faced betrayal. His father had trusted men who later sold him out. Allies turned into enemies overnight. The more he learned, the more he understood that loyalty in the cartel was fragile, a currency easily devalued by greed or fear. And so, Iván began to cultivate a circle of his own, a younger, more digitally fluent generation who would one day form the backbone of what would be called Los Chapitos. They were sons of cartel men, born into privilege but raised among danger. Together, they represented a new kind of power, educated, calculating, and globally connected. Unlike the older generation, who built empires through brute force, Iván and his circle understood the importance of stealth. They used technology, coded communication, and financial networks to move unseen. For them, violence was a last resort, not the first language. During these years, El Chapo's dominance reached its peak. The Sinaloa Cartel controlled more routes than any other criminal organization in the world. But with power came scrutiny. The Mexican government, under pressure from the United States, intensified its campaigns against organized crime. Each raid, each arrest, each headline was a reminder that no man, no matter how powerful, could remain untouchable forever. Iván began to see cracks forming in the empire. Too many people knew too much. Too many rival factions were waiting for a moment of weakness. His father's escapes and triumphs had become mythic, but myths have a way of blinding those who believe in them. Iván loved his father deeply, but he could see what others refused to admit, that El Chapo's time was running out. There were nights when Iván would stand beside his father in the courtyard, listening to the wind rustle through the mountains. El Chapo, ever restless, would speak of destiny. This world, he said once, his voice low, does not forgive softness. If you want to survive it, you must become harder than stone. Iván nodded, but inside, he felt something shift, an understanding that power, without balance, eventually consumes itself. In private, he began to think about the future differently. He didn't want to merely replicate his father's path, he wanted to adapt it. The future of the cartel, he believed, would not belong to those who shouted loudest, but to those who moved quietly, invisibly. He began experimenting with coded systems, encrypted communications, and decentralized distribution models. He saw the cartel not as a rigid structure, but as a network, something that could evolve, survive, even if one leader fell. Meanwhile, his relationship with his brothers deepened. Jesus Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquín Jr. were each carving their own places within the family's hierarchy. Together, they were learning to coexist in a delicate balance, united by name, divided by temperament. Iván, being one of the eldest, often acted as the calm voice among them, the one who thought before he acted. But he also carried the heaviest expectations. Then, as if fate were determined to test him, rumors began to circulate that authorities were closing in once again. Satellite images, informants, and intelligence leaks began to narrow El Chapo's movements. The legend who had once escaped from under the government's nose was being hunted again, and this time, Iván knew the cost would be higher. The night before one of the raids, Iván remembered sitting with his father, sharing a quiet meal. The older man seemed oddly calm, almost serene. "If they come for me again," El Chapo said softly, "don't run. Build. Protect the family. The name must live, even if I do not." Those words sank into Iván's heart like stone. It was not a farewell, it was a command. And soon, the prophecy came true. In 2014, El Chapo was captured again, this time in Mazatlan, ending one of the longest manhunts in modern history. The image of his arrest, shirtless, handcuffed, defiant, flashed across every television screen in the world. For Iván, it was déjà vu, a nightmare repeated. But this time, he did not flinch. He understood what his father had meant. It was now his turn to build. The throne of Sinaloa was empty once again, and the son who had learned patience, silence, and strategy was ready to step forward, not as a child hiding behind a legend, but as a man ready to shape his own. As the mountains darkened under the fading sun, Iván stood before them, the air thick with dust and memory. The boy who had once listened at doors was gone. What remained was a man carved by lessons of loyalty and loss, prepared for a world that would soon call him something new, El Príncipe, the prince who would inherit the empire of shadows. The world seemed to hold its breath the day Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán was captured again in 2014. Across Sinaloa, televisions flickered with the same image, soldiers in black masks, a handcuffed man with graying hair, his face calm, almost indifferent. For most people, it was the fall of a myth, proof that even legends bleed. But for Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, it was something far more intimate. It was the sound of a door closing and another creaking open. His father, once more behind bars, had left behind an empire trembling at its edges, and Iván stood at the threshold of its uncertain future. The news hit him in waves, first disbelief, then anger, then an icy calm. He had seen this before, 20 years earlier, when he was just a child. But now, he was no longer watching from behind guarded walls. This time, he was on the inside of the storm. The men who once bowed to his father began to shift their loyalties, testing the wind, whispering names that might replace the old king. The Sinaloa Cartel, though vast and deeply rooted, was a kingdom built on presence, and with its ruler gone, power began to fracture. Iván understood that hesitation was a form of death in his world. Within days of the arrest, he began moving, quietly, efficiently, as his father had taught him. He convened meetings with key lieutenants, coordinated with trusted allies, and made it clear that the Guzmán family was still very much in control. El Chapo may be gone, he said during one meeting in a safe house outside Culiacán, but his name still rules. Those words, spoken softly, restored order where panic had begun to take root. It was in these moments that Iván's transformation from heir to leader became undeniable. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had studied power his entire life. He didn't rule through fear, not yet, but through presence. He made himself visible, attending gatherings, inspecting operations, and ensuring that everyone knew the Guzmán bloodline had not weakened. He was not merely filling his father's absence, he was redefining it. Still, the challenges ahead were immense. The Mexican government, bolstered by U.S. intelligence, celebrated El Chapo's capture as a triumph of international cooperation. But they underestimated the resilience of the organization he had built. Within weeks, routes were reopened, money flowed, and shipments continued to move across oceans and borders. It was as if the capture had only strengthened the myth, proof that even when caged, the Guzmán legacy could not be contained. But Iván was not naive. He knew that every moment of calm was borrowed time. Rivals were circling, from Jalisco, from Tijuana, from within. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, was rising fast under Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera, expanding with ruthless precision. The balance of power in Mexico was shifting, and Iván could feel it. He understood that to survive, he could not simply mimic his father's methods. He needed to evolve. He began surrounding himself with a new generation of lieutenants, younger men who spoke the language of both the street and the smartphone. They were the architects of a new era of organized crime, blending technology with tradition. Encrypted apps replaced handwritten notes, coded phrases substituted face-to-face meetings. Iván, with his calm demeanor and quiet intelligence, thrived in this hybrid world. He knew that the true strength of a modern empire was not in its violence, but in its invisibility. Yet, invisibility was not easy when you bore the Guzmán name. Every move he made was watched, every car followed, every conversation suspected. He became a ghost in his own city, moving between safe houses, changing routes daily, sleeping with one eye open. The luxury of trust had vanished. Even within his own circle, he could sense cracks forming. Power, after all, was not inherited, it was constantly stolen and reclaimed. Amid the chaos, he turned again to his brothers. Ovidio, Joaquín Jr., and Jesus Alfredo were all carving their own paths in the cartel structure. Together, they formed what would soon be known as Los Chapitos, the Little Chapos. But while the nickname sounded diminutive, the power they wielded was anything but. They represented the new face of the Sinaloa Cartel, youthful, strategic, and unrelenting. Each brother brought something different, Ovidio's charm and business sense, Joaquín Jr.'s discipline, and Iván's leadership and composure. Together, they created a balance, fragile but functional. Still, unity was not guaranteed. The cartel's elders, particularly Ismael El Mayo Zambada, had their own views about succession. El Mayo had been El Chapo's longtime partner, the stabilizing force behind Sinaloa's operations. He preferred quiet management to flamboyant power, diplomacy to bloodshed. But he also understood that the Guzmán sons represented continuity, a bridge between past and future. For a time, there was peace between them, an understanding that mutual survival required cooperation. Behind the scenes, however, Iván could sense the unspoken tension. The old guard viewed him with cautious respect but also suspicion. To them, he was untested, too young, too visible, too modern. And yet, the men who worked closest with him saw something familiar, the same cold determination that once defined his father. Iván didn't seek glory, he sought order. And in a world collapsing under greed and violence, that made him dangerous. Meanwhile, El Chapo's second imprisonment became a global spectacle. Each new headline, each leaked image of the kingpin in shackles, reignited public fascination. But for Iván, those headlines were a constant reminder of fragility. His father's capture had not just removed a leader, it had created a symbol, one the authorities were desperate to destroy. He understood that if the name, Guzmán, could be erased from power, the government would stop at nothing to do it. So he doubled down on loyalty. He visited allies personally, often arriving unannounced, ensuring that every man who claimed to serve Sinaloa remembered whose name still commanded the highest respect. His presence alone, calm but unyielding, had a way of resetting the room. You can replace power, one old lieutenant once said after meeting him, but you can't replace legacy. Despite the danger, Iván never appeared hurried. He carried himself with the same composure his father once had, a quiet confidence that unnerved enemies and reassured allies. Even as raids intensified and safe houses were discovered, he adapted. He changed patterns, reinvented logistics, and ensured that the money and influence continued to flow. His world was one of constant movement, and yet, he always seemed still, centered, untouchable. But even as he rebuilt, a shadow grew over his thoughts. He knew that power in Mexico came with an expiration date. Sooner or later, the government would come again, or worse, betrayal would rise from within. He had seen it happen to men stronger than him, men who thought themselves immortal. The question that haunted him was not whether the Guzman empire would survive, but what kind of man he would become in keeping it alive. One night, standing in the desert outside Culiacan, Iván looked up at the stars, the same stars his father had once looked upon during his years in hiding. The wind carried dust and silence, and for a moment, he could almost hear his father's voice. "If they take me again," it whispered in his memory, "remember, the world forgets men, but it never forgets names." And so, beneath that endless night sky, Iván made a vow. He would protect that name. He would protect his family. And no matter what the world believed, the throne of Sinaloa would never truly be empty, because its heir had already begun to rule from the shadows. The prince was no longer waiting for his father's crown. He had already placed it upon his own head. The air in Sinaloa felt different after 2014, heavy, electric, like the moments before a storm breaks. The capture of El Chapo had sent shockwaves across the underworld, and while Iván Archivaldo Guzmán maintained the calm composure of a man in control, the world beneath his feet was shifting. Power, once solid and absolute under his father's hand, was now fluid, dangerous, unpredictable. The throne of Sinaloa stood intact, but its pillars trembled in silence. Iván had learned long ago that silence was not emptiness, it was strategy. In those uncertain months, he moved quietly, rarely appearing in public, yet his influence rippled through the valleys and cities like an unseen current. He understood what few did, that real leadership did not come from noise, but from precision. And so, while journalists speculated and governments celebrated their victory, Iván began weaving the web that would hold the empire together. It was in this vacuum of leadership that Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, truly emerged. To outsiders, they were still the kids, wealthy heirs living off their father's fortune. But inside the organization, they were becoming something much more formidable. Iván, the eldest of the active brothers, took the role of strategist, calm, meticulous, and unyielding. Ovidio, nicknamed El Ratón, was the diplomat, charming and persuasive. Joaquín Jr. and Jesus Alfredo, meanwhile, handled logistics and communication. Together, they formed a network that mirrored their father's old command structure, decentralized, adaptable, and dangerously efficient. The first challenge came from within. Rival factions in the Sinaloa Cartel began testing boundaries, sensing weakness. Some allied with the old guard loyalists to El Mayo Zambada, others drifted toward the rising CJNG, a cartel expanding with brutal precision and a taste for open warfare. Iván understood that a single show of weakness could unravel decades of dominance. So he made a decision that would define his leadership, to strike quietly, decisively, and without fanfare. Under the cover of night, his men moved through the hills of Badiraguado and the streets of Culiacan, reclaiming routes, silencing traitors, and reasserting the Guzmán name. Bodies appeared, messages were sent, not with words, but with precision. By dawn, the message was clear: Los Chapitos were not boys playing at power. They were the new architects of Sinaloa's empire. But Iván's leadership was not built on brutality alone. He was, in many ways, his father's opposite. Where El Chapo had ruled through charisma and fear, Iván ruled through calculation. He preferred balance to chaos, loyalty to spectacle. He avoided public attention, refused unnecessary violence, and kept his circle small and disciplined. Noise attracts death, he told his men once. Let them hear nothing, until it's too late. This quiet philosophy became the foundation of his rule. Even law enforcement, which had spent years chasing the flamboyant patterns of his father, struggled to track him. He was a ghost, a figure who existed everywhere and nowhere. His communications were encrypted, his movements unpredictable, his appearances fleeting. Where his father's legend had been visible and defiant, Iván's was invisible and patient. Still, invisibility had its cost. The Guzmán name was both shield and target, and every success came with new enemies. The CJNG, under El Mencho, was not content to share the crown. Their expansion into Sinaloa territory sparked skirmishes that grew bloodier by the year. Iván tried to keep the war contained, preferring to negotiate rather than destroy. But the rival cartel thrived on chaos, forcing him into a conflict he could neither ignore nor fully control. Amid the turbulence, Iván began to see that survival required more than strength, it required adaptation. The days of simple smuggling were over. Technology had become the new weapon, and information was the new gold. So he modernized. He built networks that spanned continents, used cryptocurrencies for transactions, and trained operatives in digital security. His generation was redefining the very architecture of organized crime. At night, he often retreated to the mountains, the same wilderness where his father once hid from the law. There, among the whispering pines and endless valleys, Iván found clarity. He would stand at the edge of a ridge, overlooking the lights of Culiacán far below, and think about the nature of power. His father's empire had been physical, built on roads, tunnels, and men with guns. His own, he realized, would be invisible, built on networks, numbers, and loyalty. That could not be traced. But even as he evolved, ghosts from the past refused to fade. Old rivals resurfaced, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate. Some said that elements within their own cartel were feeding information to the government, others suspected that certain allies were quietly switching sides. The more Iván tried to strengthen his grip, the more he realized that power was not something you held, it was something you constantly defended. One evening, after receiving word that one of their supply convoys had been ambushed near Durango, Iván gathered his closest men in a safe house. The air was thick with tension. "They think we are weak because we are young," he said, his tone steady but cold. "They think we inherited power we didn't earn. Let's remind them that inheritance means responsibility, and that responsibility can be ruthless." The next week, retaliation came swift and silent. No public displays, no explosions, just sudden disappearances, phone lines going dead, businesses shuttered overnight. By the time the dust settled, the balance of fear had shifted once more in Sinaloa's favor. Iván's legend, though whispered, began to take shape, the calm prince who ruled through precision, the ghost who spoke softly but moved mountains. And yet, deep down, Iván knew that every victory carried a seed of danger. His father's rise had been unstoppable, but it had also been blinding. The higher you climbed, the harder it was to see the fall coming. He promised himself that he would not repeat that mistake. He would build differently, with patience, with silence, with control. Still, there were moments, late at night, when he wondered if the world he was protecting was worth the cost. The faces of fallen friends haunted him. The endless cycle of power and betrayal began to feel like a cage made of gold and blood. But then he would remember his father's words, "A man without control is already dead." And the doubts would vanish, replaced by cold resolve. As the empire stabilized under his guidance, Iván's reputation grew, not among the public, but among those who mattered. To his allies, he was respect personified, to his enemies, an invisible force that struck without warning. The media began to call him El Príncipe del Cartel, the Prince of the Cartel, a title that both honored and haunted him. For Iván, it was not a crown of glory, but of burden. He had learned to walk the razor's edge, between loyalty and paranoia, silence and command, myth and reality. And somewhere in that delicate balance, the young heir who once listened in shadows had become what his father always intended, the man who could rule the night without ever needing to be seen. The year was 2015, and the Sinaloa mountains seemed to hold their breath once more. Word began to spread in whispers through the valleys, through safe houses and ranches, through radios that carried static and rumors in equal measure. El Chapo had escaped again. To the world, it was unbelievable. To those who knew the man, it was inevitable. But for Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, it was something else entirely, a moment that would change everything. The night the news broke, Iván was in the hills outside Culiacán, sitting quietly on the porch of a secluded property. The glow of his phone screen flickered against his face as he read the message twice, then a third time, as though trying to confirm that it wasn't a mistake. His father, the man who had taught him the meaning of control and patience, had vanished from a maximum security prison through a tunnel that stretched for over a kilometer, a feat that seemed both absurd and magnificent. There was no celebration that night. No gunfire, no drinking, no chaos. Iván simply looked out at the horizon, where lightning flickered faintly in the distance, and whispered something only he could hear. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was warning. For he understood what few others did: when a man like El Chapo returned to freedom, the world of the Sinaloa Cartel would not remain the same. Within days, chaos and anticipation rippled through the ranks. Soldiers, lieutenants, and brokers scrambled to align themselves with whichever faction they believed would emerge stronger. Iván moved quietly, deliberately. He understood the fragility of balance. For months, he had been carefully stabilizing the organization, creating order in the wake of his father's arrest. Now, with El Chapo back, every alliance would need to shift again. The empire that had survived through his subtle leadership now stood ready to bow once more to the returning king. When father and son finally reunited, it was said to be in one of the cartel's mountain strongholds, a quiet meeting, unmarked by spectacle. There were no cameras, no witnesses beyond a handful of trusted men. The old lion and his heir sat together for hours, speaking in low tones. What passed between them remains a mystery, but those close to them say that El Chapo looked upon his son with a mixture of pride and calculation. He had seen his empire endure in his absence, not crumble, not fracture, and he knew who had kept it standing. Iván, in turn, greeted his father not as the boy who once watched from doorways, but as a man who had held the reins. In that silent exchange of glances, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared blood, shared burdens, and the understanding that both knew how this story might end. For every escape, there is a chase. For every crown, a storm. As El Chapo reasserted his authority, the organization began to hum again with its old energy. Convoys moved with renewed purpose. Fields reopened. Old alliances reignited. But Iván watched carefully from behind the curtain of his calm demeanor. He knew his father's return brought not just power but exposure. The world was watching. The DEA, the Mexican Marines, and rival cartels all waited for the moment El Chapo would make his next move. In private, Iván tried to counsel restraint. The world had changed since his father's last reign: technology, surveillance, geopolitics. The age of visible power was fading, replaced by something quieter, more calculated. But El Chapo was a man born of another time, a commander of terrain and tradition, not algorithms and satellites. His instincts told him to move, to lead, to reclaim his territory in full view of the world. And though Iván admired him deeply, he knew that such visibility carried fatal risk. The months that followed were tense, marked by small victories and growing shadows. The Guzmán family became both a legend and a target again. Iván spent his nights on encrypted calls, monitoring movements, trying to contain the heat that came with his father's resurgence. He felt the storm approaching, a collision of eras, of methods, of father and son. Then came the night of January 8, 2016. Culiacán's air was thick, heavy, restless. Iván was in communication with trusted allies when the message came through: they've got him. This time, there was no tunnel, no miracle. El Chapo had been captured after a firefight in Los Mochis, betrayed by a series of digital breadcrumbs, phone calls, coordinates, surveillance drones. Technology, not treachery, had undone him. The moment the news spread, the world erupted. Governments celebrated. Reporters swarmed. And once again, the empire trembled under the weight of uncertainty. But Iván did not panic. He sat in silence, staring at a map on the table, tracing the routes his father once controlled, the mountains he once ruled. The calm in his expression was eerie, almost cold. He knew that his father's era had ended for good this time. Outside, his men waited for orders. They expected chaos, retaliation, noise. Instead, Iván spoke softly, "No one moves tonight. Let them think we are broken." His strategy was simple, patience. While the world turned its eyes to El Chapo's arrest, Iván would fade into the shadows once more, preserving the heart of the organization. In the weeks that followed, as El Chapo was transferred to a high-security prison and prepared for extradition, Iván began rebuilding from the inside. He contacted loyal commanders, secured routes, and ensured that money continued to flow through the network. For the world, El Chapo's capture meant the end of Sinaloa's dominance. For Iván, it was the beginning of a new, quieter chapter, one where leadership would be measured not by noise, but by survival. He understood that public loyalty to his father was vital. To the men of the cartel, El Chapo was not merely a boss, he was a symbol, a myth that united them. So Iván kept that myth alive. He spoke of his father with reverence, ordered protection for his extended family, and ensured that every decision made in those fragile months honored the legend. But behind that reverence, Iván's own power solidified. He was no longer the shadow of a king, he was becoming the quiet ruler of an empire without borders. At night, he often replayed the events in his mind, the reunion, the warnings, the final arrest. There was sadness, yes, but also clarity. His father had shown him what greatness could achieve, but also what pride could destroy. From that realization, Iván drew his greatest lesson, the true power of invisibility. The mountains that once echoed with the sound of El Chapo's soldiers now stood still, their silence reflecting Iván's philosophy. There would be no third escape, no more daring rescues. The dynasty would continue, but differently, in whispers, in encrypted messages, in shadows where no spotlight could reach. And so, as 2016 dawned, the world moved on, believing the Sinaloa Cartel had been tamed. But deep in the valleys of Mexico, Iván Archivaldo Guzmán was already writing the next chapter. A new kind of leadership was emerging, one born not from chaos, but from calm. And in the stillness of that realization, he made a silent vow, the name Guzmán will never fade, not while I breathe. The winter of 2016 brought with it a strange, uneasy calm to the valleys of Sinaloa. For the first time in decades, the name El Chapo no longer echoed through the radios or crackled through coded transmissions. The great escape artist was gone, locked away under the harsh lights and sterile walls of an American supermax prison. But in the quiet that followed his extradition, a new rhythm began to emerge, softer, slower, almost meditative. It was the rhythm of transition. The empire was still alive, but its heart had changed. And standing at its center was Iván Archivaldo Guzmán. He had grown into his role quietly, almost imperceptibly. While the world's attention fixated on the courtroom drama unfolding in New York, Iván worked behind the curtain, threading connections, reinforcing loyalty, and ensuring that the vast network his father built never missed a beat. Every shipment, every payment, every contact had to continue, not for greed, but for stability. Because Iván knew what few others did, the moment the machine slowed, it would begin to collapse. The men who served his father now turned to him for direction. Some did so out of respect, others out of fear, and a few out of pure necessity. The empire could not afford fractures, not now. And so Iván stepped into the role with the same calm confidence he had shown since youth, the quiet, deliberate composure of someone who understood the power of patience. He avoided the grand gestures his father favored. No new mansions, no public celebrations, no displays of excess. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, control. Control of routes, control of loyalty, control of information. He centralized operations that had once been scattered, replacing old commanders with younger, tech-savvy lieutenants who could navigate the digital age with precision. Under Iván's guidance, the cartel's communication systems evolved into something far more sophisticated, encrypted, compartmentalized, nearly invisible. By 2017, whispers began to spread that El Chapito was no longer just the heir, he was the ruler. Yet, even as his influence grew, he remained almost ghost-like. Few could claim to have seen him in person. He did not attend public gatherings, he avoided phone calls, and he moved only through a trusted circle of intermediaries. His leadership was like a breeze through tall grass, felt, but never seen. The transition was not without challenge. Within the cartel, power struggles brewed. El Mayo Zambada, his father's longtime partner and one of the last old guard leaders still at large, was both ally and potential rival. Theirs was a delicate balance, two figures bound by legacy yet separated by vision. El Mayo was a man of tradition, preferring negotiation and discretion, while Iván represented a new generation, global, strategic, and quietly ruthless. Still, they maintained peace, for both knew that open conflict would destroy everything they had built. And so, through intermediaries and coded messages, they shared control, dividing responsibilities like two chess masters sharing a single board. For the time being, it worked, the cartel continued to thrive, its network stretching from the jungles of Central America to the ports of Europe and Asia. Outside Mexico, authorities celebrated El Chapo's imprisonment as a victory. Headlines proclaimed the end of an era. Yet, in the quiet towns of Sinaloa, nothing truly changed. The trucks still moved under cover of night. The planes still crossed the skies. The wealth, though hidden, still flowed. Only the names behind the commands had shifted, from father to son. Iván's leadership style reflected his personality, quiet, precise, and efficient. He spoke little, but his words carried weight. He demanded loyalty, but rewarded competence. He was not easily angered, yet once his patience broke, his retribution was swift and absolute. "Respect is the only language I speak," he once told a confidant. "Fear is for those who don't understand it." He also understood the importance of optics, the illusion of distance. To the outside world, Iván cultivated the appearance of a man detached from operations, a figure content to live quietly in Culiacán. But behind that illusion, his hand guided everything. He had learned well from his father's mistakes, visibility was vulnerability. So while others sought fame, Iván sought silence. Yet, despite his caution, danger never slept. Rival cartels sensed opportunity in El Chapo's absence. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, led by Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera, grew bolder, pushing into territories once thought untouchable. Skirmishes broke out in Jalisco, Colima, and Baja California, each one a test of resolve. Iván watched carefully. To strike too soon would invite chaos, to wait too long would invite weakness. He chose his battles with surgical precision, using intelligence, not intimidation, to guide his hand. Those who worked close to him spoke of his calm even in crisis. They said he would sit for hours in silence, staring at maps, tracing routes with his fingers, his mind miles ahead of the present moment. "He doesn't think like a boss," one associate remarked. "He thinks like a player who's already seen the last move." But beneath that control was something deeper, an awareness of legacy. Iván understood that he was not just running an operation, he was preserving a dynasty. His father's legend had become myth, and myths, once born, cannot die. People still sang corridos about El Chapo in bars and marketplaces, and with every note, the Guzmán name grew stronger. Iván made sure of it. He financed songs, shaped narratives, and turned his father's story into a living memory, a mythic shield that protected the family's influence. Still, the myth came at a cost. Every song that glorified the past made it harder for him to build the future. The more the world obsessed over El Chapo, the less they saw the quiet power of El Chapito. It was both a blessing and a curse, anonymity disguised as inheritance. One evening in late 2017, Iván sat alone in a safe house outside Navolato. The hum of cicadas filled the air. He poured a glass of mezcal, its smoky scent blending with the night breeze. His phone buzzed, another encrypted update from one of his commanders. Everything was stable. The network held firm. Yet, as he looked out into the darkness, a quiet thought lingered in his mind: for how long? He knew the cycle well. Every empire, no matter how silent, eventually draws attention. Every piece carries within it the seed of its next storm. For now, he ruled a kingdom of whispers, but he could feel the tension building, from rivals, from governments, from ghosts of the past. Still, Iván smiled faintly. His voice, calm and steady, broke the stillness of the night. The louder they celebrate, the less they see. And as the moon hung low over the fields of Sinaloa, he returned to his maps, to his numbers, to the invisible empire he had built in his father's shadow. For Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, this was not just survival, it was evolution. The world believed the dynasty had fallen. But in the quiet heart of Mexico, beneath the hum of crickets and the soft glow of distant towns, the Prince of Sinaloa was still very much awake, calm, deliberate, and patient as ever. The years that followed, 2018 and 2019, unfolded like a slow burn under the desert sun. The Sinaloa Cartel, once led with fiery charisma by El Chapo, now moved with a kind of quiet precision that reflected its new generation of leaders. Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, calm and analytical, continued to steer the empire from the shadows, but for all his caution, one truth remained: power never sits still. Every whisper from the mountains, every rumor in the streets of Culiacán carried the same undercurrent: the throne of Sinaloa was no longer held by one man alone. Inside the organization, factions began to stir. Some swore loyalty to El Mayo Zambada, the ghostly patriarch who had survived every storm. Others bent their allegiance to Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, Iván, Jesus Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquín Jr. It was not an open war, but a chess game in silence. And in that game, Iván was determined to prove he was no pawn. He had always understood that bloodlines carried both privilege and peril. The Guzmán name was a crown, but it was also a target. His father's legend had built the empire. Now that same legend threatened to tear it apart. Every ambitious lieutenant, every restless commander wondered whether El Chapito had inherited his father's ruthlessness or merely his reputation. Iván, aware of the whispers, decided to answer that question not with words, but with action. He began reasserting control in territories that had drifted away after El Chapo's imprisonment. Quietly, efficiently, his men moved into Sonora, Durango, and parts of Baja California, taking over operations with minimal bloodshed. His strategy was not conquest, but persuasion. Instead of demanding loyalty through violence, he offered stability, higher payments, guaranteed protection, and the assurance that the Guzmán family still had reached beyond imagination. Those who resisted met silence first, then disappearance. By the time word spread, resistance had turned to loyalty. But beneath this expanding calm, a storm brewed. The younger Guzmán brothers were not all cut from the same cloth. Iván, disciplined and calculating, often clashed with Ovidio, whose charisma and impulsiveness attracted a younger, more reckless generation of followers. Jesus Alfredo, meanwhile, served as the communicator and financier, smoothing tensions while managing logistics across borders. Their alliance was strong in public, but behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Despite the internal differences, their greatest threat came from outside, from Nemesio, El Mencho Oseguera and his rapidly expanding Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. Brutal, disciplined, and militarized, the CJNG represented a new kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on secrecy but on spectacle. Their tactics were loud, their videos brazen, their message clear: they wanted the throne. Iván watched the rise of CJNG with the detached patience of a chess master observing an opponent make bold moves. He refused to be drawn into open warfare. "They fight with noise," he once told a trusted lieutenant, "but noise burns itself out. We move like wind." Yet even the wind can be challenged. Skirmishes erupted in contested regions, and though the Guzman faction held its ground, the message was clear: the days of unchallenged dominance were gone. Then came a night that would test everything Iván had built. October 17, 2019, a date that would forever be etched in Sinaloa's memory. It began like any other humid afternoon in Culiacán. The air was thick, the streets busy. But by evening, the city would descend into chaos. Mexican federal forces had captured Ovidio Guzmán López, Iván's younger brother, in a brief, bloody raid. For Iván, the news struck like lightning. There was no time for deliberation. Within minutes, he mobilized. Calls were made. Roads were blocked. Convoys of heavily armed men poured into the city, their black trucks roaring like thunder down the narrow streets. Culiacán became a war zone. Civilians hid in their homes as gunfire echoed from every direction. The soldiers who had captured Ovidio suddenly found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, overwhelmed, and terrified. It was Iván's voice, calm yet unyielding, that directed the response. His orders were precise: block every exit, surround every government building, and make it clear that the city would burn before his brother was taken away. He did not shout. He did not panic. He simply acted. Within hours, the message was clear: release Ovidio, or face an urban nightmare. The Mexican government, unprepared for the scale of the reaction, yielded. Under pressure and chaos, Ovidio was released. The gunfire subsided as suddenly as it had begun. The city fell silent again, blanketed in smoke and disbelief. The event would come to be known as El Culiacanazo, the Battle of Culiacán, a day when the world witnessed the power of the Guzmán family in full force. To the government, it was humiliation. To the people of Sinaloa, it was both fear and fascination. To Iván, it was something deeper, proof that control was not just inherited, it was earned. In one night, he had done what few could imagine: he forced the hand of a nation. And yet, as the adrenaline faded, he sat quietly in the aftermath, aware of the cost. The operation had been necessary, but it had exposed the empire to the world once more. In the following weeks, Iván retreated into silence. He refused interviews, declined celebrations, and forbade any of his men from boasting. "Pride makes noise," he said coldly. "Noise brings death." Instead, he redirected focus inward, securing routes, protecting families, and restoring the balance that chaos had threatened. The Culiacanazo changed everything. It redefined Iván's image: no longer just a silent strategist, he was now seen as the decisive force behind Sinaloa's enduring power. Within the organization, respect turned to reverence. Among rivals, fear deepened. And within the government, frustration grew. Iván had proven that the Guzmán dynasty was not a relic of the past, it was alive, coordinated, and capable of defying an entire state. But Iván saw the event differently. To him, it was not victory, it was warning. A reminder that visibility, no matter how fleeting, came with danger. In his private reflections, he understood that this battle had awakened something larger: international scrutiny, renewed manhunts, and an obsession among law enforcement to capture Los Chapitos. The storm that his father had once outrun was forming again, only this time, it was coming for him. Still, Iván's resolve did not waver. He had seen the power of unity that night, the way thousands of loyal men moved with precision at his command. That power, he knew, must be preserved, not through fear, but through trust. And so, quietly, he began rebuilding, preparing for the inevitable future when the world would come knocking again. As night fell over Culiacán weeks later, the city lights shimmered faintly under a thin veil of smoke. From a quiet hillside outside the city, Iván watched the horizon. The hum of distant motorcycles echoed faintly, the rhythm of a city that would never forget that day. He took a slow breath and whispered to himself, "They think they saw power. They only saw loyalty." For Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, the Battle of Culiacán was not the peak of his power, it was merely the beginning of his legacy. The night after El Culiacanazo ended, the air in Culiacán carried a strange, electric stillness. The gunfire had stopped, the roads were clear, but the city had changed forever. The people spoke of what they had seen in hushed voices, convoys of armed men moving like shadows, soldiers surrendering under pressure, and the impossible truth that one family's command could force a government to its knees. It was, in many ways, the night when myth became real again. But for Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, it was the night when he learned the true cost of control. He sat alone in a dimly lit room on the outskirts of the city, a glass of water in his hand, the smoke of gunpowder still clinging to his clothes. Around him, his most trusted men waited silently. No one dared to speak. They could feel his exhaustion, not from fear, but from the weight of command. He had made the call to save his brother, and the entire world had seen it unfold. It was both his greatest act of power and his most dangerous exposure. Iván's eyes traced the patterns of the ceiling as he replayed the day in his mind. The decisions, the timing, the chaos, everything had gone according to plan, and yet, he felt no triumph. He understood that victory had a price. The world now knew what the Guzmáns were capable of, and that kind of knowledge never stayed quiet for long. Within weeks, governments across North America began to move. Intelligence agencies ramped up surveillance, international task forces restructured their focus, and every digital footprint connected to Los Chapitos became a target. Drones began to patrol areas that had once been untouched. Planes circled higher and more often. Even encrypted channels started showing signs of intrusion. The invisible war had begun. But Iván was prepared. He had built his world to survive scrutiny. Each of his operations existed as fragments, small, disconnected cells designed so that no single capture could bring the structure down. It was a system of mirrors and silence, where loyalty replaced paperwork, and every message disappeared seconds after being read. He had learned from his father's mistakes. El Chapo had ruled through presence, Iván ruled through absence. Still, despite his caution, he could not silence the noise outside. International media painted him as a ghost prince, ruthless, untouchable, the man who had humiliated an entire nation. Corridos sang his name across Mexico, blending fact and fiction into something larger than life. Children in the barrios whispered about El Chapito as if he were a legend returned from the mountains. The myth grew faster than he could contain it. And with myth came danger. For every man who admired him, another plotted against him. Rivals within the cartel saw his fame as an opportunity. The government saw it as a reason to strike again. And among his own circle, whispers of ambition began to spread. Iván understood that power, once revealed, attracts both loyalty and betrayal in equal measure. So he acted before the cracks could form. Over the following months, he quietly reshaped the inner workings of his organization. Commanders who showed too much independence were replaced. Those who hesitated were reassigned. In their place, Iván elevated younger men, disciplined, loyal, trained in technology and tactics rather than fear and force. The transformation was subtle, but deliberate. He was no longer leading an old-world cartel, he was building a modern network, one that could adapt faster than anyone could track. His leadership style became almost ritualistic. He insisted that meetings take place in motion, inside vehicles, in forests, on the move. He spoke briefly, clearly, and never twice about the same topic. He allowed no recordings, no photos, no signals. If they can't see us, he told his team one night, they can't predict us. His methods frustrated law enforcement and fascinated analysts. To them, Iván was a paradox, a man whose empire touched every continent, yet whose personal footprint seemed to vanish into thin air. But beneath the surface, something deeper stirred, a tension between survival and legacy. Iván often found himself reflecting on his father's path. El Chapo had ruled with charisma, earning loyalty through presence and generosity. Iván's rule, though effective, was colder, more mechanical. It worked, but it left him isolated. In private moments, he felt the loneliness that comes with invisible power. No laughter, no celebration, no faces he could truly trust. Only silence, strategies, and shadows. At times, when the stress of command grew heavy, he would retreat into the mountains. There, among the whispering pines and echoing canyons, he found the only peace he could afford. He would stand on the same ridges where his father once stood, breathing the same cold air, looking down at the flickering lights of Culiacan far below. In that stillness, he often asked himself the same question: was it worth it? He knew the answer, though he rarely admitted it. For men like him, there was no way back. The empire was his inheritance and his curse. Every choice he made was tied to his bloodline, every shadow shaped by his name. His silence, his precision, his caution, all of it came from one truth: the Guzman family could not afford another fall. Then came an unexpected shift, one that blurred the line between myth and reality even further. In early 2020, as the world turned its eyes toward a global pandemic, law enforcement in Mexico and the United States launched a new, silent campaign targeting Los Chapitos. Instead of raids or public arrests, they used a quieter weapon: financial strangulation. Assets were frozen. Front companies were dismantled. Trusted accountants disappeared. It was a different kind of war, one fought not with bullets but with numbers. Iván recognized the strategy instantly. "They want to make us ghosts," he told his brother Jesus Alfredo during a rare family meeting. "But ghosts don't need banks." His tone carried both defiance and exhaustion. He had spent years mastering invisibility, but now he faced opponents who had learned to fight in silence too. As the world outside slowed under lockdown, the empire adapted. Smuggling routes shifted. Contacts went underground. Transactions moved deeper into the digital dark. For the first time, the war between cartels and governments had entered a new realm, one where borders meant little and silence meant everything. In that silence, Iván thrived. The fewer people moved, the more valuable information became, and information was something he understood better than anyone. He used the global slowdown to strengthen his grip, to rebuild networks, test loyalties, and prepare for the storm he knew would come once the world reopened. But there were nights, quiet and heavy, when even he could not silence the unease inside him. He knew what his father's story had taught him, that no empire, no matter how quiet, lasts forever. The tunnels, the convoys, the loyalties, all of it existed on borrowed time. Still, he refused to let that thought slow him. "Legacy is built in silence," he would say. "The world remembers the noise, but the power comes from the quiet." Outside, the cicadas hummed softly, their rhythm blending with the distant sounds of Culiacan returning to its restless sleep. Inside, Iván sat alone in a darkened room, his phone face down, his thoughts miles away. He had survived the storm, reshaped the dynasty, and kept the empire alive. But even in victory, he knew, peace, for men like him, was never real. It was only the pause before the next command. By the time the world began to recover from the pandemic, Culiacan had changed again. The city seemed quieter on the surface, but underneath, something restless stirred. In the shadows of empty nightclubs and behind the polished windows of armored SUVs, deals continued, and alliances shifted like the tides. Iván Archivaldo Guzmán had survived yet another test, but in his survival came a new kind of danger. For the first time, his name was known beyond Mexico's borders in a way he could no longer control. The U.S. Treasury had sanctioned him directly, calling him a high-ranking leader of the Sinaloa Cartel. His image appeared in reports, sometimes blurry, sometimes clear, always accompanied by words like violent, powerful, elusive. The man who had spent his life building invisibility now found his face appearing on international screens. And yet, no one really knew him. Behind the scenes, Iván had begun reshaping the structure of his influence once more. He no longer wanted the kind of chaos that defined the old era of the cartel, convoys with mounted weapons, open wars in the streets, or public displays of dominance. That world belonged to the past. The new era would be one of quiet precision, financial sophistication, and silence. To rule the new world, he needed to master the art of disappearance. He began relying on technology in ways that echoed his generation's instincts. Encrypted communications, cryptocurrencies, and intermediaries formed a new foundation. His inner circle evolved into a tight, disciplined group of young operators, educated, discreet, and loyal only to him. Theirs was not the world of dusty ranches and AK-47s anymore. They lived in condos in Culiacán, Guadalajara, and Mexico City, speaking in codes that could pass for harmless business chatter. It was a ghost empire, hidden in plain sight. But for all his control, Iván could never escape the gravity of his surname. The legend of his father loomed over him like a shadow cast by a mountain. El Chapo's image, the small man with the enormous power, had become immortalized in songs, documentaries, and court records. People still whispered about his escapes, his tunnels, his defiance. And every time they did, Iván's name was whispered beside it, as if the two could never be separated. He understood this intimately. Legacy, after all, was both a gift and a curse. The same myth that kept him respected also kept him hunted. The same power that opened doors also closed his freedom. It was a paradox, one he could neither escape nor fully accept. There were nights when the city felt too small for the weight he carried. He would drive through the outskirts of Culiacán in silence, the sound of the tires on the dirt road the only rhythm breaking the stillness. The headlights illuminated empty fields and distant ranch houses, ghosts of a world that once thrived on chaos and fear. Now, the power was quieter, but more total. Sometimes he would stop, step out, and look up at the stars, the same stars that had watched his father before him. He wondered whether El Chapo, during his years in hiding, ever felt this same mixture of power and confinement. To rule an empire so vast, yet never truly be free to walk under open skies. The irony was bitter. His thoughts often returned to family. The Guzmán legacy was not just his to carry, it was shared with his brothers. Each one had his role, his territory, his men. Together they were Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo. But unity, even among blood, was fragile in their world. Trust was not given freely, even within family lines. And as time passed, Iván learned that silence between brothers could be as dangerous as open rivalry. Meetings between them were rare and brief, often held in safe houses where no electronics were allowed. They spoke in short sentences, their words heavy with unspoken meaning. Jesus Alfredo, his younger brother, often carried a cautious optimism, always seeing opportunities. Ovidio, quieter, more thoughtful, carried the burden of being both admired and watched. Between them, Iván was the axis, the one who made decisions when the room fell silent. It was a role he neither asked for nor refused. Yet beneath that composure, something in him had changed. The events of El Culiacanazo, the years of constant pursuit, the endless reshuffling of loyalty, all had begun to leave their mark. He had become more guarded, less trusting, less willing to show emotion. His voice, once sharp and commanding, had grown quieter, deliberate. Every word he spoke now felt measured, as if even his tone carried consequences. There were moments of calm too. The Sinaloa countryside still offered him refuge, with its golden fields and gentle winds. The ranches remained untouched, symbols of continuity in a world that changed too fast. He would ride through them on horseback, the same way his father once did, feeling the rhythm of the land beneath him. The air smelled of rain and soil, and for a few brief hours, he could almost forget the world that waited beyond the hills. But peace never lasted long. With his father serving a life sentence in a U.S. prison, the world expected Los Chapitos to fill the vacuum, to lead with the same authority, the same ruthlessness, the same legend. And though Iván had the mind for strategy, he lacked his father's appetite for spectacle. He preferred the quiet chessboard to the battlefield. Still, he knew that the world would not stop watching. When news broke that the U.S. government had placed multimillion-dollar bounties on their heads, Iván did not flinch. He understood the message. It was not just a pursuit of justice, but a declaration of intent. They wanted the Guzmán name erased from history. They wanted to end the myth. And yet, every attempt to erase that name only strengthened its echo. The Guzmán story had become something larger than any single man, a symbol of defiance, a reflection of Mexico's complex relationship with power and survival. It was legend interwoven with reality. As the years passed, Iván began to sense that his life had entered a new phase, one defined not by growth or expansion, but by endurance. Every move had to be calculated, every appearance controlled, every alliance reconsidered. His world had narrowed into precision, like a blade sharpened endlessly until it gleamed under the faintest light. One night, while sitting alone on a terrace overlooking the city, he thought about everything that had brought him here, the childhood silence, the weight of his father's name, the chaos of rescue and revenge, the cold calm of command. The city lights below flickered like dying embers, and he felt something close to peace. But then, as the wind moved through the palm trees, another thought crossed his mind, a realization that both haunted and grounded him. The more invisible he became, the more powerful the myth grew. His silence had become his legacy. And in that paradox, he saw both freedom and imprisonment. He closed his eyes, breathing in the night air. Somewhere far away, he could hear the faint echo of a corrido carrying his name, turning his life into melody, myth, and memory. He let it fade into the darkness, the words dissolving into the hum of the city below. For Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, the prince who inherited the Sinaloa throne, the game was no longer about survival or power. It was about balance, between myth and man, past and present, shadow and light. And as the stars watched in silence, he understood the truth that had eluded even his father. Sometimes, the greatest power lies not in being seen, but in being remembered by the silence you leave behind. The morning sun rose slowly over the valleys of Sinaloa, painting the hills in soft gold. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, and in the distance, roosters called out to the waking land. For most of Mexico, it was another ordinary day, quiet, familiar, unchanged. But for Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, this dawn marked the beginning of yet another turning point. The world outside his hidden world had grown louder, and the walls around his empire were beginning to close in once again. The United States had intensified its pursuit. Intelligence agencies, frustrated by years of failed operations, had shifted their strategy. Instead of chasing him across the mountains or intercepting convoys, they were now targeting his network from afar, through satellites, financial monitors, and digital surveillance. The Sinaloa Cartel was no longer just a local or regional threat, it was a global entity. Every transaction, every movement, every coded message had become part of an invisible war fought through screens and data. Iván understood this change better than anyone. He had always been a student of adaptation. As governments evolved, so did he. His organization had once thrived on secrecy and violence, now, it thrived on complexity. Layers of legitimate businesses masked the movement of wealth. Trusted figures, with clean reputations and unassuming lives, handled operations that even his closest allies knew nothing about. Still, he knew that nothing remained hidden forever. There were whispers, rumors of betrayal, quiet leaks from people who had grown tired or careless. It was the curse of every long-standing empire, the enemy was never just outside the gates. It was often already inside. So Iván tightened the circle again. The meetings became smaller. The trust became thinner. He moved less frequently, spoke even less. Those who had once been friends were now carefully observed from a distance. His paranoia, though rooted in reason, began to isolate him further from the world. And yet, in those long, silent nights, there was a strange kind of peace. His life had become routine, a ritual of stillness and caution. He would spend hours studying reports, reading encrypted updates from his men, drinking black coffee as the sound of crickets filled the air. There was calm and control, even if that control came at the cost of connection. But outside his quiet refuge, the world was changing in ways even he could not ignore. In early 2023, the capture of his younger brother, Ovidio Guzmán, once again ignited chaos across Culiacán. The news spread like wildfire, gunfire in the streets, helicopters circling the skies, and soldiers flooding neighborhoods. The Culiacanazo of 2019 had returned, only this time, there would be no surrender. Iván watched from afar as his brother was taken away, and the city erupted in fury. The gunmen who once moved under his command took to the streets again, not for profit but for loyalty. For family. The sound of battle returned to Culiacán, echoing through the same hills that had once been silent. For Iván, it was both a reminder and a warning. No matter how far he distanced himself from violence, his family name would always bring it back. In the days that followed, he remained invisible, but his absence spoke louder than any appearance. His men waited for orders, his allies looked for signals. He gave none. To act would mean exposure, to stay silent meant control. And in that silence, he watched how the world reacted. Governments claimed victory, the media celebrated the capture, and analysts speculated whether the empire would finally crumble. But those who truly understood knew better. The Guzmán dynasty was built not on one man's power but on continuity, a web so intricate that no single thread could unravel it completely. Iván was the architect of that design. He knew that the world expected him to retaliate, to show force. But instead, he chose patience. The world saw nothing, and that nothing became its own form of strength. In private, however, the capture of his brother weighed heavily on him. Family, for all its complexity, had always been the one thing he still valued beyond strategy. He felt the sting of helplessness, the same kind that haunted his father during his years in hiding. Power, it seemed, could move mountains but not fate. There were moments, late at night, when he would pour a glass of mezcal, sit on his terrace, and look out at the dark horizon. The lights of Culiacán shimmered faintly in the distance. He thought about the years that had passed, the battles fought, the friends lost, the quiet nights that felt longer than time itself. Somewhere deep inside, he wondered whether it was all worth it. Whether the power he held had brought him anything more than survival. But he never allowed those thoughts to linger. He had learned that reflection was a luxury for men who had already escaped their stories. He was still living his. And in his world, hesitation was danger. In the weeks after Ovidio's capture, international news outlets once again filled their headlines with the Guzmán name. Commentators speculated on the fate of Los Chapitos, painting them as symbols of both defiance and decay. Some called them relics of a dying empire, others, the last heirs of an enduring legacy. Iván read the words quietly, expressionless. He had long understood that perception was a weapon, and sometimes, letting the world believe in your fall was the most effective way to ensure your survival. Amid all this, his network adjusted, quietly and efficiently. Routes were rerouted. Contacts replaced. The empire moved like water, reshaping itself without losing volume. Iván no longer needed to prove power, he needed only to maintain balance. And balance, for him, was the highest form of control. Still, he knew that time was no longer on his side. The governments hunting him were becoming smarter, more patient. The old loyalty among local communities had faded, fear had been replaced by fatigue. Younger generations no longer sang corridos about El Chapito with the same awe, their fascination had shifted to new faces, new legends. The world was changing, and for the first time, Iván felt the shadow of obsolescence creeping near. He began thinking of legacy again, not the one written in reports or sung in bars, but the one that would remain in silence. He understood now that the Guzmán story was no longer about dominance, but endurance. Power that survives long enough to fade without being destroyed. One evening, as rain began to fall softly over the hills, Iván stood by the window, watching the droplets trace slow paths down the glass. His reflection stared back, older, calmer, harder. The boy who once dreamed of his father's approval was gone. The man before the glass had become something else entirely, a symbol of survival born from fire, silence, and time. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in a U.S. prison cell, his father lived out his final years, the legend that had started it all. And though Iván would never say it aloud, he knew that one day, when the world spoke of El Chapo, it would also speak of him. Not as a copy, but as the continuation of a story that refused to die. The rain thickened, drumming softly on the roof. The world outside blurred into gray. And in that moment, Iván closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the sound of the storm drown everything else. The world could chase him, label him, hunt him. But as long as he remained unseen, unheard, untouched, the empire lived. It was then that he finally understood the paradox that had defined his entire existence, that the throne he inherited was not made of gold or blood, but silence. And as long as that silence endured, so would his power. The world outside the walls of Sinaloa had grown more uncertain, more complex, and far more watchful. It was now the mid-2020s, and the legend of the Guzmán family had transcended the boundaries of crime and myth, becoming part of global folklore, whispered in markets, sung in dimly lit cantinas, and analyzed in the cold fluorescence of government offices. Yet in that strange duality of fame and fear, Iván Archivaldo Guzmán existed like a ghost, present everywhere, but seen by no one. The city of Culiacán had returned to a deceptive calm. The same streets that once trembled under the roar of armored trucks now carried the hum of ordinary life. Children played soccer in alleys painted with murals of saints and sinners, and the scent of roasted corn filled the evening air. But beneath that peace, the pulse of power still throbbed, invisible, disciplined, orchestrated from the shadows by a man who had mastered the art of stillness. Iván had grown quieter with age. The fiery ambition of his youth had hardened into something colder, sharper, the kind of patience that only men who had seen the limits of power could possess. He no longer sought dominance through fear, he sought endurance through invisibility. The less he appeared, the more powerful his myth became. But myths, no matter how carefully crafted, had cracks. Deep inside the empire, old loyalties began to fray. Some of the younger commanders, those raised in the digital age, ambitious and restless, began questioning the old ways. To them, Iván's restraint looked like weakness. They wanted spectacle again. They wanted the old rhythm of open power, of songs and parades and defiance. Iván, however, saw beyond their impatience. He knew that the moment the empire returned to noise, it would begin to die. Violence attracted attention, and attention brought collapse. He remembered his father's fate too vividly to make that mistake again. El Chapo had ruled through presence, Iván would rule through absence. His strength was not in making noise, but in outlasting it. Still, whispers of dissent reached his ears. There were murmurs from the northern corridors, young lieutenants questioning the silence, older men fearing irrelevance. Betrayal, in his world, was as natural as breathing. But Iván had learned not to panic. Instead, he listened. He let the tension grow, watched who spoke too freely, and waited. In the empire of shadows, time itself was a weapon. When the moment came, his response was quiet and precise. There were no gunfights, no dramatic confrontations. Just absences. Men who once led small armies simply vanished, their phones silent, their homes abandoned, their names erased. The message was clear. Silence was not just a strategy, it was law. But power built on fear was fragile, and Iván knew it. So he began reinforcing another layer, respect. He made sure that in the communities of Sinaloa, families were protected, money flowed, and no harm came to the innocent. In regions under his control, order returned. Roads were repaired, festivals resumed, and people whispered his name with a complicated mixture of gratitude and caution. It was an old truth his father once believed too, that power endures when the people beneath it can live without chaos. At night, in his private compound hidden among the hills, Iván would sit by the terrace and listen to the sounds of the countryside, the rustle of wind through the trees, the distant barking of dogs, the faint hum of a world that never fully slept. The stars over Sinaloa had always seemed closer, brighter. He often found himself staring at them for hours, his mind drifting between reflection and resolve. Sometimes, he would think of his father, the small, intense man whose shadow still stretched across every decision he made. El Chapo had lived with conviction, believing himself invincible until the very end. Iván respected that strength but also recognized its blindness. His father's legend had been built on courage, his own was built on control. Both were forms of survival, but only one, he believed, could last forever. In quieter moments, he would think of his brother Ovidio, imprisoned far away. There was sadness there, hidden under layers of composure. He wondered whether his brother's nights were filled with the same kind of silence, the same waiting. In a way, they were both trapped, one behind concrete walls, the other behind his own invisibility. Different prisons, but prisons nonetheless. As months passed, Iván began noticing how the myth of the Guzmáns evolved without his hand. Corridos still mentioned him, but now with reverence rather than rebellion. People called him El Fantasma del Norte, the ghost of the North, a figure who moved through time without leaving footprints. It was a name that carried both power and peace, and he wore it like armor. Still, deep down, he knew legends could outlive their truth. Myths grew wild, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And though he had spent his life shaping perception, he had also learned that stories had lives of their own. The Guzmán name had become something far beyond the family, a symbol of both resistance and tragedy, of power and loss. It was during one of those sleepless nights, while sitting by the window of his safe house, that Iván found himself thinking about legacy in a way he never had before. He realized that his life had been one long inheritance, of power, of fear, of destiny. But inheritance, he now understood, was not the same as purpose. His father had fought for survival. Iván had fought for control. But control over what? A name? A legend? A silence that swallowed everything? The rain began to fall again, soft and steady. He watched as the droplets hit the window and trickled down, merging, splitting, disappearing. Everything in life, he thought, eventually dissolved into something else, power into fear, fear into silence, silence into memory. Perhaps, that was what legacy truly was, not what one built, but what one left behind in whispers. Still, he could not allow himself to surrender to reflection for too long. The world outside his thoughts demanded action. Governments were tightening sanctions, alliances were shifting, and technology was changing the very fabric of control. Every day brought new risks, new ways to be seen. And for a man who lived by invisibility, being seen was death. So he adjusted once more. Routes moved deeper underground, both digital and physical. Trusted operators were replaced with younger, nameless professionals. Messages became shorter, rarer, sometimes nothing more than a single symbol. His empire was evolving, but so was he. The days of open command were over. He had become more like an idea, the unseen architect whose influence lingered in every corner of the map. There were no photographs, no sightings, no recordings. Only fragments, a rumor in Guadalajara, a convoy seen at dawn, a whisper in a corridor. And through it all, Iván remained exactly what he wanted to be, untouchable, unknowable, unbroken. But in that silence, another truth began to surface, one he rarely allowed himself to feel. Power had kept him alive, but it had also left him alone. The men who once laughed beside him were gone. The family he fought for was scattered. The world he ruled no longer belonged to him entirely. He had become the ghost he was named after, powerful, respected, but alone. As dawn began to rise, he stood and walked to the edge of the balcony. The hills of Sinaloa stretched endlessly before him, covered in a soft morning mist. He breathed in deeply, feeling the air cool against his skin. For a moment, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine what life might have been had he been born without the weight of a throne. Perhaps he would have been a farmer, a teacher, or simply a man free to walk the streets of his own city. But destiny does not negotiate, and Iván had long accepted that. The world had written his story before he could choose his lines. His only freedom was in how he delivered them. And so, with calm resolve, he turned away from the sunrise and back into the shadows where he belonged. For in those shadows, silent, endless, eternal, his power remained. The legend of the Guzmán family would continue, not through noise, but through the quiet endurance of a man who understood that the truest throne is not the one everyone sees, but the one no one can ever touch. The years were beginning to blur now, each one folding quietly into the next. The world outside had changed, louder, faster, filled with noise that no longer concerned him. But within the hills of Sinaloa, time still moved slowly, almost tenderly, like a river finding its old path. Iván Archivaldo Guzmán had learned to live with silence. It was no longer his enemy. It was his companion. He was no longer the young prince the world once whispered about. His name, once spoken with a mix of awe and fear, had softened into rumor. Some believed he was gone, others said he still pulled invisible strings from the shadows. He neither confirmed nor denied. The truth, like all power, lived best when hidden. Each morning, the mountains woke with the sound of birds and distant bells from the valleys below. Iván would rise early, his steps measured, his thoughts heavy but calm. He had begun to notice the small details that once escaped him, the scent of rain on dust, the way mist clung to the trees, the sound of water trickling through the rocks. These were things that men of war often forget, and yet, they were the only things that endure. He thought often of his father. Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán, once untouchable, was now caged thousands of miles away, aging behind concrete and steel. For Iván, that reality was more than tragedy, it was instruction. The old world, built on defiance and dominance, had collapsed under its own weight. He had seen what happened to men who refused to let go. The walls always win in the end. Still, blood carried duty, and duty carried ghosts. Iván remained tied to the past, not by greed, but by lineage. His family's legacy was both burden and inheritance. He managed what was left, not through violence, but through memory, through quiet balance. What remained of the Guzmán network moved more like an echo than an army, its strength in silence, not spectacle. There were days when news reached him, whispers of betrayal, of new enemies rising, of shifting borders in the unseen wars of the north. He listened, never reacting too quickly. He had learned patience, the hardest weapon to master. The world no longer needed kings, it needed survivors, and he intended to remain one. At night, when the valleys dimmed and the stars took their place, Iván often sat outside, wrapped in thought. He would recall his youth, the speed, the chaos, the illusion of control. He had once believed that fear was the same as respect. Now he knew better. Respect was not commanded, it was remembered. And memory fades more gently than fear ever could. Occasionally, he wrote notes in a small leather-bound journal. Not records of deals or routes, but reflections, on loyalty, betrayal, and the strange cost of ambition. He wrote for no one but himself, as if putting words to paper allowed him to drain the noise that still lingered in his mind. To be powerful, he once wrote, is to be alone. To survive power is to accept that truth. In the rare times he met with others, his presence was calm, almost disarming. The temper that once marked his youth had mellowed into quiet authority. He no longer demanded loyalty, he inspired it by being still, by listening. Those who worked with him often said his silence spoke louder than any threat. But even he could sense that the balance was shifting. The empire his father had built, the one he had inherited and tried to preserve, was fading into history. It was no longer about dominance, it was about dignity. He wasn't fighting to expand anymore. He was fighting to end things properly, to let the Guzmán name fade without collapse or chaos. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, he stood outside his home and looked over the land. The sky glowed with warm amber light, and for a moment, everything seemed at peace. The mountains, ancient and unmoved, held his family's story like old scars, deep, quiet, unhealed but accepted. He thought of all that had been lost, the brothers, the friends, the certainty of youth. And yet, he felt no sorrow. Only understanding. Every kingdom, no matter how strong, eventually belongs to the earth again. That night, he wrote one last line in his journal before closing it: "There is no throne without shadow, and no shadow without end." But even the darkest shadow disappears when the light decides to rise. He placed the journal on the table beside a small candle, its flame trembling against the walls. The world outside might never know the thoughts of Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, but here, in the still heart of Sinaloa, the Prince of Silence had found his truth. And perhaps, in the gentle hum of the night, that truth was enough. The empire had survived longer than anyone expected, but the weight of time was beginning to show. Iván Archivaldo Guzmán watched from afar as the new generation of cartels rose, loud and reckless, unaware of the lessons his father's fall had written in blood. He no longer sought to command, he observed, patient, quiet, a shadow in the land his family once ruled. He had learned that true power was silence, the kind that moved without being seen, that endured without needing to conquer. The Sinaloa name still carried weight, but it was no longer a banner, it was a warning. Even his allies had changed, speaking less of loyalty and more of survival. From his mountain refuge, Iván studied the changing currents, governments shifting, alliances crumbling, sons trying to wear crowns that didn't fit. He knew what they didn't: the higher one climbs, the colder the air becomes. Some nights, he felt his father's ghost in the wind, a whisper reminding him of what ambition costs. But Iván was no longer chasing glory. He had turned inward, preserving what remained of the family's legacy with patience rather than power. The world saw only rumors, but he had already stepped into a different realm, one where peace was rarer than gold. He was no longer fighting to rule Sinaloa. He was fighting to disappear from it. The news broke like thunder: Ovidio Guzmán had been captured again. The headlines blazed, the world's attention briefly returned to the family name, and then, as always, the noise faded. From his hidden sanctuary, Iván listened in silence. Another cycle had turned. Another brother had fallen to the weight of their inheritance. He felt no anger, no shock, only inevitability. The world they had built was collapsing under its own legend. Ovidio's capture was not just a loss, it was a message. The dynasty was ending, not with a shootout, but with exhaustion. Iván knew what came next: the vultures, the betrayal, the slow disassembly of what once seemed indestructible. Yet, beneath the sorrow, there was clarity. He understood now that survival wasn't about fighting, it was about letting go. At dusk, he walked alone through the pines, the scent of earth and rain thick in the air. Each step felt lighter, as though the land itself was urging him to rest. For years, he had lived between worlds, loyalty and regret, memory and myth. Now, as the wind moved through the trees, he finally allowed himself to breathe. His father's empire was gone. His brothers were scattered. But Iván Archivaldo Guzmán, the prince who once inherited the throne, had found something rarer than power: peace in his own disappearance. The empire had grown quiet now. Gone were the convoys, the coded radio calls, the hurried footsteps in the night. Iván Archivaldo Guzmán spent his days high in the Sinaloan hills, where the world seemed distant and the silence heavy with memory. From his window, he could see the faint glow of Culiacán, once the heart of his father's power, now just another city fading into modern noise. He knew the end of an era never came with explosions, only with stillness. The cartel's strength had scattered, its loyalties fractured by time and greed. Yet Iván didn't fear the slow unraveling. He had outlived wars, betrayals, and prisons. What remained was peace, quiet, heavy, earned. Some nights, he walked to a small chapel hidden among trees. There, the air was cool and still, untouched by the chaos of his past. He would sit in silence, whispering no prayers, only thoughts. His father's face came to him sometimes, not as the king of tunnels, but as a man who had loved, fought, and fallen. Iván understood him now. Power was never meant to last, it only borrowed time. He began to withdraw from the world, delegating, disappearing, fading. No more gunfire, no betrayals, no last stand. Just silence. In that silence, he found a strange freedom. The Prince of Sinaloa had become its ghost, content to let the legend dissolve into the mountains that had always kept his family's secrets. Evening settled softly over the mountains, painting the sky in gold and violet. Iván sat alone on his porch, the cool air brushing his face. The world had moved on, yet here, time stood still. He thought of his father, not as the myth but as the man, flawed, proud, and relentless. The stories people told now felt distant, like echoes of another life. He watched the valley lights shimmer below, tiny stars scattered across the earth. Somewhere, people still whispered his name, though few remembered the truth. The Guzmán Empire had become legend, not glory, not tragedy, just memory. And Iván had learned to live with that. He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing softly in the dark. The smoke rose, vanishing into the wind. The mountains around him were silent, eternal. They had seen everything, rise, fall, and fading. Power, he realized, was not about ruling, it was about knowing when to let go. He whispered to the night, "We are all only chapters." Inside, an old radio played a slow ballad, one his mother once sang. He listened as he stepped indoors, closing the door gently behind him. Outside, the wind carried his story away, the prince who had inherited a throne of shadows and, in the end, found peace not in power, but in silence.